Hey guys, welcome to Devistry, and it is finally 2021, and I figured I'm going to make a video which a lot of you guys and a lot of people on the internet hopefully will find interesting. This is going to be a quick start guide to web development in 2021. So in this video I'm going to outline what, in my opinion, will be the easiest path to become a web developer with modern technologies and modern software in 2021. A beginner-friendly roadmap into web development. So in this video, I'm going to outline all of the things that I should, or that I think that you should learn, kind of in order. Now, I will mention this. There are a couple of different paths you can take in web development. We have front-end development, back-end development, there's some other things as well. So what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to start off by explaining the basic skills you should have, whether you're going to do front end or back end, doesn't matter. Then we're going to focus on just the specific things you should learn for the back end and then for the front end. And you can also, of course, use this guide to become a full stack developer, which is a developer who uses both the front end and the back end, or develops for both the front and the back end. Just to quickly mention what that all means, front end is all of the client-side stuff that users interact with, usually in the browser or on the screen of an app. And the backend is all of the things that happen behind the scenes in a server or with databases, stuff like that. Also to quickly mention some of the tools you should be using. Now, the great thing about web development is that it doesn't really require any crazy tools. But still, to mention it, you need, of course, a computer. There's a lot of discussions online for what kind of computers you should have, what kind of operating systems are best for web development, and really it doesn't matter. You can code on the crappiest old laptop. You can work with macOS, Linux, or Windows, doesn't matter. As long as you have a computer where you can type on and it has internet access, you should be okay to do at least the most basic things, but also the more advanced stuff don't really require powerful computers. Then you need a code editor, also known as an integrated developer environment, which is just a fancy name for a code editor. And I would highly recommend checking out Visual Studio Code if you're not using it already. So if you're completely new to web development, check out VS Code. It is a free-to-use software. There's no paid version, so it's completely open source and free. And it is very lightweight, which means that out of the box, it doesn't really do a lot. It's just a code editor with a couple of tools that will help you code better. And that's actually great, because for beginners, you don't really want crazy amount of tools that you have to learn. But the great thing about VS Code, Visual Studio Code, is that it's highly customizable. So if you need some other functionality that doesn't come with VS Code out of the box, you can easily install it using some extensions, which you can navigate in the VS Store, the VS Code extension marketplace or extension browser, whatever they call that. So it's highly customizable, which is great. Then, of course, you need a web browser, if you're going to work on websites, that is. Obviously, you're going to have a web browser that you already use for the internet, but there's a couple of browsers that are better, maybe, with some tools installed for development. Out of the three that I would recommend, I recommend Chrome the most, but Firefox and Edge are also great. I wouldn't really recommend Safari or Opera. They lack some of the tools that you can get as a developer with Chrome, Firefox, or Edge. And I definitely would stay away from some old browsers like Internet Explorers. Those are years out of date, are full with security issues and just not modern anymore. I would recommend Chrome the most because it has the most developer tools, but Firefox is a very close follow-up in my opinion. So definitely also go with Firefox. Edge is also perfectly suitable. All right, so let's get started with the skills you should learn. So these are the basic skills that you should learn. Whether you're going to do front or back end doesn't matter. And you should start with HTML and CSS. These are the fundamental languages of any website. There's no alternatives. You need to know HTML, CSS to create a website. Really, you only need to know HTML, but then your website will look horrible because CSS is a styling language. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. HTML adds the content and the structure in which that content is displayed to the page. So all of the text, in what order the text is displayed, images, links, and where those links point to when you click on them, input forms, stuff like that. That's all added with HTML. So you should start by learning the basic syntax, which is the way that it's written. HTML uses tags, which create elements. So you can surround some text with a certain tag to create, let's say, a paragraph, and a different tag creates a header. and a different tag is for an image, a different tag is for a link, stuff like that. You want to learn some of the basic elements like creating text, showing images, links, maybe even lists or tables or input forms so that people can enter information you can send somewhere. Those are all kinds of elements you can create with HTML. And you also want to learn the basic idea about page structure. And with basic HTML, that means understanding elements that are what we call block versus inline. So inline means that elements are horizontally aligned, and block means that they're vertically aligned. That's the basic structure you can create with HTML. Now after that, you should learn CSS. CSS is cascading style sheets, and it's the language that we use to style the elements we add with HTML. So the CSS syntax consists of what we call selectors, which is some code that allows us to select specific elements on the page we would like to style. And then we can add all kinds of styling like colors, backgrounds, and changing the font. Let's say we want to make some text bold or underlined, or want to make larger, or just a different font altogether. That's all possible. And you should also learn the box model, which is the basic way that CSS or browsers size and position elements. So with the box model, you can add margin for some white space, you can add borders, you can change the size in pixels of elements. So those are the basics of creating web pages. Now, once you've learned that, you'll quickly discover that the pages are quite boring. They don't really do anything after they've been loaded. So for that, you should learn JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language that is used in the browser to make web pages dynamic. So once the page has been loaded, HTML and CSS don't do anything. The browser just loads the HTML and CSS, displays what they intend to display, and then it's done. With JavaScript, you can make interactive things, dynamic things. And it's very important that you understand that. Now you may be wondering, before I talk about JavaScript, why you should learn this if you want to become a backend developer. Because the backend is basically all programming. It doesn't even need JavaScript necessarily. So why would you learn HTML, CSS, and JavaScript? Well, the backend serves the front end. The backend serves the front end with data and files. So you should know at least the basics of the front end, even if you're going to do backend development. Otherwise, you have no idea what you are serving. Oops, what your code is serving. So learn HTML, CSS, and the basics of JavaScript, even if you want to do backend development. All right, so the basics of the JavaScript language. So JavaScript is a language on its own. It's a programming language. You can make computers do things, but the main thing that JavaScript is intended for is DOM manipulation. The DOM is the document object model, and that is the structure of all of the elements you add with HTML. So with document object model manipulation, which you can program with JavaScript, we can manipulate these elements. Now, in order to do that, you first have to understand the basics of the JavaScript language. Things like variables, which is how you store data like numbers and text in memory, so you can use it later on in your code. If statements is how you create decisions based on your data. Let's say you want to check if some text that the user has entered in a text field is equal to some other text. If so, you want to do something. If not, maybe you want to do something else. Loops, how you repeat code for a certain amount of time. Functions is how you group code together so you can execute them at a given moment. Let's say when the user presses a button. Arrays, which is how you structure data in a list. So you can have multiple bits of data as a list structure. So you can loop through that list and do things based on every item in the list. And then you want to learn about objects and JSON. Objects are JavaScript's way to create complex data. Let's say we need to represent a customer in our memory in the computer. So we can create a JavaScript object that represents a customer. And the customer will have all kinds of properties like a name, an address. Maybe he has a list of items that customer has in his shopping basket of a web shop that can be created in an object. Now, it could also be useful to send that data of that customer, that object, somewhere else. And for that, you can use JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it allows you to save objects created in JavaScript to a text file or to send it over the internet to, let's say, a server to store it in a database. So those are your basic JavaScript things you want to learn about. Now, in order to actually make JavaScript do something on the page, we need to learn some DOM manipulation things, like understanding what events are. When the user presses a button, it triggers an event, and we can detect that event with JavaScript and then run some code that we want to do when the user presses that button. You also want to learn how you can find elements so that you can, for example, change their text or change the style or create new elements. We'll talk more about DOM manipulation later when we talk about front-end specific things. But these are the absolute basic things you want to be able to do with JavaScript. Oh, by the way, I have not mentioned this, but in the description below the video, so look down below the video, click on read more. You will find links to all of these tutorials or articles on all of these subjects I'm talking about. So I'm just quickly going over all of the skills you need to learn, of course. This is not a tutorial. I have links to tutorials and guides in the description below for all of these subjects. So check it out if you want to actually find places where you can learn about HTML, CSS, or JavaScript or whatever. So these three languages, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, also known as the Holy Trinity of the web, those are the languages that create websites. There's no other language involved to create a website. So if you've already learned this, and we're only just starting with this video, you can already create some pretty nice websites. But there's still way more stuff to learn. Most of these things that we're going to learn now are just further details, further advanced things, and also a lot of tools that will help you make advanced things more quickly and more easily. For example, we have some coding tools. These are some tools that you might want to install. Some actually come pre-installed with Visual Studio Code. Some will come in the form as an extension to VS Code. That will help you code better. For example, Emmet, which is a tool that comes pre-installed when you get VS Code, is an HTML toolkit. Sometimes writing a lot of HTML code takes a lot of time. Emmet offers shortcuts, short snippets of text you can enter, and then it automatically adds a large amount of HTML ready to go. Prettier is a code formatter which makes your code more readable, which is actually surprisingly important. And ESLint, ES stands for ECMAScript, which is the official name of JavaScript. And a linter is a code analyzer, and ESLint will give you warnings for bad code practices. So it's just a code that will keep an eye on your code, and it's a tool that will keep an eye on your code, and it will give you tips on how to improve it. Really useful. I can't live without these tools. Then we have something that a lot of people kind of, are daunted by, Git and the terminal and GitHub. And I understand why, because Git is a command line tool, or a tool that happens in the terminal. So you have to open that weird text interface where you enter text commands on your computer. It does not have a graphical user interface. That's not entirely true. There are programs like VS Code that allow you to use buttons, and you can see things happening graphically that interact with Git, but you should learn the Git commands. So what is Git? Git is a VCS, a version control system. And if you have ever programmed or coded before, or if you're about to, you will quickly discover that, coding is quite difficult. So it is hard to predict the future of what your code, or how your code is going to work in the near future. So maybe one day you have created some code and it works really well, and then the next day you're going to continue writing your code, and suddenly everything breaks and you have no idea why, and you wish that you could just go back to yesterday when everything worked. That is why we have Git. It's a version control system. What we can do with Git is what we call making a commit, or making a commit version. And that basically takes a snapshot of all of your code in a folder, and it remembers that. And then we can just keep on coding, and then let's say we are happy, we make another commit, or if we discover that I've made a terrible mistake and all of my code is broken, we can always revert back to the previous commit. So it basically makes backups. Now Git is a CLI, a command line interface, which means that we need to use a terminal, which is that usually black window with white text commands and all kinds of weirdness on your computer, and we need to create text commands to interact with Git. So it is important to start learning first how a terminal works, also known as a command prompt. We have different terminals on different computers, different operating systems. So on Windows, the default terminal is PowerShell. So you should be able to find it on Windows. I think on Mac it's called iTerm. I might be wrong about that. I don't use Mac. And I think on Linux it's called just Terminal. I might also be wrong about that. I don't use Linux. But all of your computers have a terminal. So you might want to check out some of the guides in the description below to see what you need. So the terminal is basically just a text interface to interact with your operating system. So normally we of course have graphical stuff like icons. We can double click to start a program. Click and drag files into different folders, copy and paste stuff. That is all graphically done. We can do exactly the same operations, but with text commands in the terminal. So you want to learn how you can manage your files in the terminal, creating files, deleting them, moving them around, making new folders. And you want to learn how to execute commands, like starting up a program like Git. So once you've learned that, you want to install Git and learn how you make commits. You also want to learn about branches and merging, which is how you can work on multiple features in the same project without actually messing things up in a different branch. So you can actually work with multiple people on the same files. Everyone works in their own branch or on their own features in a different branch. That's basically little side steps from the main code. And then once everyone is done, we can merge everything that everyone has created into single files, and then everything should hopefully work together. So that is another thing that Git offers. Now you can also use GitHub, which is an online place where you can store these Git repositories, these folders which Git is tracking the files of. And I see I've made a typo. This should be a repo, not a repo. But yeah, it's an online repository. Or you can get an online repository. So this means that, so of course, normally Git is just a folder on your computer. But if you want to collaborate with other people, like if you're working in a team at a company, which is very likely that you will do as a web developer, you want to be able to push your changes to the GitHub repository so that other people can pull them, so that they can get them on their computer. So it's an online place where you can get your projects. You also want to learn about pull requests. So if you're working on a project that is not yours, for example, an open source project, or if you need to get permission to actually make changes to the project by your project owner, let's say, you need to make a pull request, which is basically requesting to the owner of the project that they pull your changes into the project. So it's a way to collaborate with people on code. That's what GitHub is for. It uses Git to collaborate with other people. So then, of course, we have the whole issue of hosting. So once you have created a nice little website, you want to host it so that people can find it on the internet. And for that, you need a hosting provider and a domain name. So hosting providers provide their servers, which are just computers serving HTML, CSS, JavaScript files to people who ask for them in their browser. That's what the hosting provider is. There's a couple of options. My main hosting provider that I usually pick is Netlify. It is very simple. It's completely free to host simple websites there. Really great. Once you host something on Netlify, though, it will generate a domain name for you. But you can also add your own domain names. So if I host something on Netlify, let's say I have Crazy Cat Pictures as my website name, it will generate a domain name crazycatpictures.netlify.app. So that might not be the address that you want to give to people, but it's great for just, displaying some little project that you've created. It's very simple. You just create an account, you drag and drop your website's folder, and it should work. Description has a tutorial on Netlify. GitHub page is very similar. It just allows you to, for free, I think it's free. I've actually not used GitHub pages yet. But it allows you to just display your simple websites. Now, if you want something more advanced, more control over exactly how your website behaves, and there's all kinds of craziness you can do with web servers, you might want to check out a hosting provider that has cPanel, like Hostinger, which is a pretty common one. Hostinger, HostGator is also pretty popular. There's many more, but cPanel is a tool that you use to interact with your hoster's server, so you can configure it yourself. There's definitely configuration you can do with Netlify and GitHub pages. cPanel is a bit more advanced. Wouldn't recommend it for a beginner, so if you have a simple website you want to display to other people, just use Netlify, maybe GitHub pages. So, of course, we also want domain names. Domain names are the actual URL or the address we enter in an address bar, like google.com, wikipedia.org. So you want one for your own website if you, of course, don't want to use the automatically generated .netlify.app or etc. domain name. So you can buy domain names usually for a couple of dollars on websites like Namecheap. That is the one that I would recommend. You can search for available domain names and buy them. And then you can tell Netlify, hey, I have bought this domain name, use it for my website. And then Netlify uses that domain name. Really nice. So these are all of your basic technical skills you should learn before you further look into front-end or back-end development. But there's one other thing that I would like to address, and that is soft skills. So all of the things we have been talking about so far are technical skills, knowledge, those are hard skills. Soft skills are more people skills or personal skills, stuff like that. And those are actually very important if you want to get a job in web development or just to help yourself out. So things like creating a career. In the description below, all kinds of links that will help you with stuff like this. Marketing yourself so that, if you want to get a career, you need to market yourself so that companies will find you. Maybe you want to create a portfolio website. That's very common practice to show other companies what you can make. Or maybe you have created an app, you need to market your product, your app, so that other people will buy it. You also want to learn how to learn, because you'll do a lot of learning, so it is a good idea that you know about what learning is. And learning works different for many people. I myself personally hate the way that you are supposed to learn at schools, where you just listen to a teacher or you read a book and then are supposed to remember things. And that's not how I learn. I always found school quite hard because I can't really learn very well just by reading something. What I need to do is see things in practice and then do it myself. So this is another tip I would like to give you. Practice a lot, make your own products, even though you think you haven't mastered all of the skills. Just use Google as your guide. Google is the best tool you have available. But yeah, learning how to learn, there's all kinds of tips and tricks on how to learn and remember stuff better, specifically focused on software development as well. So links in the description. Learning about how you can improve productivity and focus and avoid procrastination. In my opinion, software development is one of the jobs that require, probably one of the jobs that require the most focus. There's definitely other jobs as well. But it's difficult to maintain focus because you'll be wasting, or not wasting, but spending a lot of mental energy, because coding is difficult. It requires a lot of energy by your brain. And after a time, your brain is just tired. Early in the afternoon, you just get tired and you lose focus, and then you lower your productivity. There's a lot of tools available, simple things actually. You just can read them in 10 minutes and then you can already apply them. Links in the description below again. Simple tools, simple tricks that really help, at least for me, increase my productivity. So I would like to share some links with you about that. Fitness and diet, very important. We are not athletes or anything as software development, quite the opposite, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't think about this. Now, we all know, of course, the benefits of good fitness and good diet because it's healthy, but that's not really what I mean here. Studies have shown that exercising for only 15 minutes per day increase your productivity by 60%. That is quite a lot. Now, this is an average, of course, but for some people it can go up to 60% or higher. So if you don't exercise, and this can just be like going for a walk or doing a little bit of running or lifting some weights for 15 minutes each day, let's say in the morning, you can increase your productivity a lot. Diet, again, very similar. A good diet, it gives your brain more energy. It gives it the correct nutrients. It gives your whole body the correct nutrients. Mind and body are very closely connected. So if your body is not working correctly because you feed it the wrong stuff, because it's not fit, then your mind will also suffer. And as a result of that, you lower productivity and you can't learn very well. So all of this stuff is connected, as you can see. Now, another very important problem under software development is stress. And when you have too much stress, burnout, and I can tell you from experience, burnout is hell on earth. It is way worse than what most people think, is that you are constantly tired. It is literally suffering and pain, and yeah, it's not nice. So learn how to recognize stress, how to prevent stress so you can avoid burnout, which is one of the most common issues that basically software developers become what will you call it? Basically disabled. I mean, you could almost call it like that. It's one of the most common ways that software developers can no longer work. It's not any like other issues like diseases. It is burnout. So learn how to recognize and prevent stress. It's one of the most common issues. Anyway, enough about these soft skills. Let's talk about some specific things. I'm starting with the backend because I think the backend is, let me say it in a different way. I'm going to focus on JavaScript-based backends in this video. Backends are just computer programs that run on a server that, usually serve files and data and connect to a database. That's all they do. And they can validate the data and do all kinds of other operations. That can be created with all kinds of programming languages. Great programming languages might be Python or PHP or C# or Java. But I'm going to choose JavaScript. Why? Well, you probably need to know a bit of JavaScript already, just as general knowledge, as we have discussed. So why not use JavaScript on the backend? It's actually a great language. There's nothing wrong with JavaScript. Actually, I really like it. I wouldn't pick it over another language right now. And I also think that JavaScript-based backends are simple and easy to create, but still very powerful. Now, I'm not an expert on all possible languages. I've used a couple different systems. My personal favorite is JavaScript. And like I said, this roadmap that I'm painting in this video is meant to make it the easiest possible path. And I think that would be JavaScript. Another great benefit of learning JavaScript for backend programming is if you have learned backend and you also want to do a little bit more front-end development, well, then you're a full stack developer. Vice versa, if you have focused first on front-end development more and then you want to do a little bit of backend development, you are a full stack developer, which is actually a highly sought after skill, that you know both sides of software development or web development. It's highly sought after in companies, and you'll probably get a higher paycheck because of it. Very high chance that they will be using different languages, but I should also mention that once you know one language, it's actually not that difficult to switch to a different language. Programming is not the same as a programming language. Once you learn a programming language and you learn to program with it, it's easy to switch to a different language, like Python or whatever. Anyway, so we'll focus first on the backend in this video, and then we'll talk about the further front-end specialization. So backend, servers, and databases. Let's check it out. So if you're going to use JavaScript on the backend, you need to learn some more advanced JavaScript than just those basics we've mentioned so far. You want to learn about scope, which is where can you access the data that you create in your code. There's a couple of different ways to create those variables: let, const, var. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Link in the description below for more detail. The dreaded this keyword. The this keyword is one of the most annoying things in JavaScript. It has to do with objects and functions, and it is weird. I'm not going to explain it. Look it up. It's something that you should understand because you're going to encounter it a lot with some more advanced JavaScript. Arrow functions, which are a different way to write functions. And array methods. So arrays again are lists of data, and you want to do things with the data. So array methods are things you can do with the data in an array. So you can filter the array to find specific things that match your criteria. Let's say you want to filter an array of names for all of the names that start with the letter A. Or map, which is how you can convert the data in an array to another array, but with data based on the previous array. Or find, so you can find something in the array. Callbacks, which are functions that when they're done execute another function, which can then, if they are done, execute another function. So you get this structure of functions that call back other functions. And kind of similar to that, asynchronous JavaScript. So sometimes processes take a long time, and when it happens, very likely they will want that process to be asynchronous. That means that if I'm going to execute a bit of code that takes a long time, we're not constantly waiting for that code to complete, because if we were, then we can't do anything else. The browser would hang, it would stop until we're done. With asynchronous JavaScript, using promises and the async and the wait keywords, we can actually say, okay, I'm going to start some code that takes a long time, that creates a promise, which promises that it will execute some code once it's done, but meanwhile, it's going to continue with all of the other code that still needs to happen. So we don't hang the program, we don't lag the program. These are just some concepts that I'm just throwing out here. Links again in the description below. These will only make sense once you have learned the basics of JavaScript. So don't think by watching this video you should already know what I'm talking about. But I'm just listing here what I consider are the important things for using JavaScript on the backend. So let's learn about how we use JavaScript to create servers. We will do that by using Node and Node Package Manager. Node is a program that allows to execute JavaScript. Just like your browser can execute JavaScript in the context of a website, Node.js allows you to run JavaScript in the context of an operating system. Now this is interesting because normally, or in the old times, JavaScript was just a simple scripting language that you use to script websites. It can't do anything outside of the browser, and the browser is very limited. For example, the browser is not allowed to delete files on your computer. But normal programs can, of course, do that. So with Node.js, you can create normal programs running on JavaScript. In other words, we can use Node.js to run JavaScript on a server. It's a JavaScript runtime. So you want to learn how to install Node and how you can use it to run JavaScript, which is actually very simple. And then you want to learn about NPM, Node Package Manager. So this is something that you'll encounter a lot in web development. You'll very often want to do something that very likely other people have already created code for that does exactly that thing. Let's say I have two dates, like a moment in time, and I want to calculate the exact amount of seconds between those specific moments in the time. Well, you can do that with normal JavaScript, but it's a little bit of a pain in the ass. So maybe someone has already created some code that does exactly that. We call those things libraries, which are sets of JavaScript code, or just code in general. It's also for other languages, but libraries, and those offer you all kinds of tools that allow you to do things. For example, there's a library called Moment, which does all kinds of things with dates and time. So you may want to install that. Now you can just download it and insert the code manually, but it's really not really nice. It becomes messy very quickly. You want something to manage all of those libraries or packages. And for that, Node.js actually has a Node package manager. And so NPM packages are great ways to manage your code from other people. So you want to learn how to use NPM. It's again a command line tool, but it's very simple. You want to learn how to install packages or to update them once they have made changes. You want to update those packages so you have the updated code. You want to learn how to delete packages from your list of packages you have installed. Then of course, once you have installed them, you want to learn how you use them, how you include them in your code with the require function on Node.js or with import in the browser. We'll also talk about Node and NPM later in the front-end track of this video, but for now we're talking about the backend. And you also want to learn about NPM scripts, which is how you can run automated commands. Now, it's kind of vague all, but Node and NPM basically offer you tools to run JavaScript outside of the browser and to interact with. So NPM is a tool written on Node to basically work with packages created by other people. Now let's talk about making servers with Node. So we are going to make servers primarily with ExpressJS, which is an NPM package, and it's a JavaScript framework that allows us to make simple servers. Or I should say, it allows us to simply make servers that can still be advanced on Node.js. Now, before you learn Express, I would still recommend learning a bit about how Node.js actually works as a server. So Node.js has a package pre-installed, which we call a module actually, called the HTTP module. So you want to learn how you set up an HTTP server, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, which is the protocol sending data over the internet. And you want to make a server that will be able to listen for incoming requests and then process that and send a response. So let's say our front end needs all of the data in some kind of database or in a data file. We want to be able to detect that request and then handle it. So alongside of that, you want to learn how to use the file system, which allows you to do CRUD operations, C-R-U-T, create, read, update, and delete on files, which is something that the browser, of course, is not allowed to do. But on your own computer, on your own Node.js program, you can, of course, create, read, update, and files and delete files. So you can set up some files on your server and send them to the frontend, for example, when the frontend requests those. Now, making complex servers on Node.js itself is doable, and it's actually not that difficult, but ExpressJS is a framework that makes our lives a lot easier. So once you learn the basics of what a server is and what HTTP is and how Node works with that, you want to install Express and learn that. And then you want, of course, see how you can way more easily set up an Express HTTP server handling HTTP requests and responses. Express also allows you to set up very easily routing. Routing is basically the process of setting up different scripts that run for different requests. So you can detect different requests on different paths into your server. And you also want to learn about middleware, which is how you can call some functionality before you handle the request. For example, if you have a request endpoint, so that's a request we can handle, that requires a user to be logged in, we can create some middleware function, and that first processes the request to figure out if that user is authenticated, if he is successfully logged in, and only then will we process the request. So there's all kinds of cool things. May not make too much sense right now if you have never heard about all of this, but that's cool things we can do with Express that make our life a lot easier. Now, one of the more common things you actually are going to use your server for is to interface with a database. We also call our servers often an API, Application Programming Interface, which is a way to, by programming, have another application interface with something. Application Programming Interface, API. So one of the more common things that your front end might want to interface with through our server is a database. Now we, or at least I would recommend that you are going to use MongoDB. It is very commonly used. It's probably not the most commonly used type of database. That would be a SQL or SQL database. SQL stands for Structured Query Language, usually called SQL. That's a different language to interact with SQL databases. We are using just JavaScript to interact with anything, so that's great. so we don't have to learn another language. SQL is definitely something you might want to look at later, but I would recommend starting with MongoDB. Now, the difference between SQL and, let's say, a MongoDB database is that SQL stores data in a table structure, kind of like an Excel sheet with columns and rows, and you use SQL to the SQL language to search or add or delete things in that table. And with MongoDB, we create what we call documents, which are just something that looks a lot like a JavaScript object actually, or JSON, that describes a single thing. So instead of having a table with all of the rows being a customer, we have multiple documents for a customer. So just, just not using a table, we just store documents like a file drawer, let's say. Just multiple documents for a customer or whatever else we want to store in a database. Anyway, so in my opinion, it's more simple than SQL. SQL is probably a bit more powerful and you can do more things with it. That also makes it harder to learn. Both are equally great. All right, so we're going to use MongoDB with Mongoose. MongoDB is our database. Mongoose is another NPM package, a JavaScript library that allows us to connect up to MongoDB and interact with it. So you want to learn how to set up a database with MongoDB. We can do that on MongoDB Atlas, which is a free-to-use cloud provider for a MongoDB database. You can make databases completely free, as many as you want, with limits. Not as many as you want, but still quite a lot. And the database size cannot be over 0.5 GB, which is actually quite a lot of space for small apps, because you'll basically be storing very small text-based bits of data. And you can store a lot in 0.5 GB. So it's completely free up until you get more than 0.5 GB of data. Then it's a couple of dollars for a bit more per day or whatever. So it's not that expensive. So you want to learn how to use Mongoose to connect to your MongoDB Atlas database, and then you will create what's called a model. So a model describes all of the interactivity with a certain kind of document. So we could have a customer model, and that model stores what a customer is. So it stores all of the properties of a customer, the name, the address, maybe the amount of items the customer has bought, all kinds of data. And it stores all of the functionality on how we interact with a customer. So we could CRUD, create, read, update, and delete customers or other models or other documents. So with that model, we can create a customer. This is all JavaScript, by the way. Just with a single line of JavaScript, you can create a customer. Another line of JavaScript can find a customer, or we can find all of the customers that have bought more than 10 items in our database, stuff like that. Update an existing customer's name. Maybe there was a typo made in the name. We want to update it, or delete it if the customer wants to cancel his account, let's say. So those are the things we can do with MongoDB. So that is one of the more common things you're going to use your server for, interfacing with a database. Now, once you've created your server and your database, you want to host your server so that it actually becomes public online. So then if you have your front end hosted on, let's say, Netlify, you want to host your backend also somewhere so that the front end can actually interact with it. Otherwise, it's just only locally on your computer. Only you will then be able to interact with it. Now, my choice for hosting Node apps is Heroku. Heroku is free to use. It has a reason to buy it though. We'll talk about it in a moment, but it's very simple to use. What you do is you install a very small little program called the Heroku command line interface. Again, command interface, so use a terminal to interact with it. And it actually uses Git to upload your files, your server files to Heroku. So you make an account on Heroku, you install the CLI, and then you can use Git, which you should already know by this time, to basically push or upload your files to Heroku. Heroku will then automatically start up your server, if there's no errors in the code, of course, and then it will run. You also want to be able to configure Heroku, set up your custom domain name for your server, setting up environment variables and all kinds of other things. We'll talk about it in a moment. You want to learn how you configure that, but it's a very nice, simple to use system for hosting Node apps. Now, like I said, Heroku is free, but the downside is that if your server is not being used, so there's no incoming or outgoing requests or responses for more than 2 hours, the server shuts down. That doesn't mean it's no longer usable, but it means that next time an incoming request comes in, the server has to start up, which can take a couple of seconds. So if you have an app that not a lot of people use, maybe only once or twice per day, let's say, then every time someone opens the app up, it seems like the frontend is not able to connect to Heroku for 10 seconds, and it seems like there's a very long waiting time. This is why you might want to buy a subscription for Heroku I think it's like a couple of dollars per month, and then you can get an actual always up server. It's not that expensive actually, so it's great. So that is Heroku. Now, quick talk about some other things for the backend. We want to be aware of web security, and you want to be able to create user accounts. Now, user accounts might not be something that you need for all of your apps, but you can imagine lots of apps you need user accounts so that you can have users store personalized data. But user accounts are kind of a pain in the ass because you have to deal with a lot of security. So you first want to learn about common vulnerabilities. I've listed 3 things that happen quite commonly. Cross-site scripting, which happens when you have a problem in your code that allows, let's say, a hacker or someone with bad intentions to execute their own code in your app. This can happen, for example, if you have in your front end an input field and you literally execute whatever the user enters in that input field as HTML code to maybe display it on the page. It becomes HTML. So the user can enter their own headers and their own text and their own images. But you can also enter JavaScript in HTML. So if you have something like that, users can just enter JavaScript which will be executed. And then if you write some JavaScript code that connects to your server and steals your stuff, you have an issue, of course. That's basically cross-site scripting. There's also cross-site request forgery, which I'm not going to go into the details of. Links in the description below. Data leaks or password leaks. So if you leak out the password to your database and you store people's passwords in your database for the accounts, you have a big issue, obviously. You also want to learn about environment variables, which is a better way to store like secret keys, like API keys for different APIs or passwords to things. Environment variables are not in your code, they're in this case, Node.js environment itself, but you can still interact with it through the code. Now, let's talk about all of that in different videos. Then you want to create user authentication or accounts. So you shouldn't do that unless you know about the existence of some common vulnerabilities and what you should do to avoid those. So authentication, learn what the process is of registering and logging in users. So when you register a user, you have an input field on your front end where the user can enter a username and a password, and then you send it to the backend to create a new account of that. So you could, of course, say, okay, I'm just going to save the username and the password in the database, and the next time the user tries to log in, I'm going to compare what they have entered to what's in the database, and we see, okay, this user has an account, it's the correct password, I'm going to log in. Now, that is not really how you want to approach it. For example, you want to do password encryption. Like I said, if you have a leak, if the way to connect to your the way to connect to your database leaks out, or if you just completely lose your password to the database that someone has put on a little post-it note. If you just literally save people's passwords as text in the database and it leaks out, other people can access it, well, you can imagine the problems with that. Suddenly people can hackers can access those people's bank accounts if they use the same password. They can access their medical data on their hospital account, whatever. So you can see that is an issue. So you always want to encrypt passwords. Not going to go into the details how. Links in the description below. So then once someone logs in, you want to save a proof that someone has been logged in by your server in what we call a token, which is usually created with JSON Web Token. So that's a way to securely create proof that someone is logged in by your server. And it stores proof in there that has been created by your server, not by someone else's server. So no one can act as if they have a valid token that they themselves created. And then you want to learn how to store the tokens. So you can use cookies for that. Use HTTP only cookies. That will be my recommended way to store tokens in the browser, so that the browser knows that it has to prove that someone is logged in. Okay, there's a whole process involved with authentication. I actually have a complete course on Udemy, link in the description below, about what we call the MERN stack, which uses MongoDB, Express, React on the front end and Node.js. And we go into a lot of detail about authenticating users. So if you want to learn more about all of these technologies we're using to become a full stack developer and also learn how authentication works, check out that course. It's basically a course talking about everything in this video. So that is all of my stuff I would recommend you learn for backend development with JavaScript. Let's talk about the front end, which is how you can create websites and web apps By the way, the difference between a website and an app is kind of vague. I would personally say that a website is simply web pages that don't really do a lot. They're not really like a tool. For example, a restaurant's website where you can view their menu, see their opening and closing times. That will be a website. A web app is more like a tool, like Dropbox, WhatsApp web, Google Drive, stuff like that. YouTube, that will be a web app in my opinion. So on the front end, we're focusing a lot on styling, so CSS. So you want to make sure your website looks exactly how you want it, but also a lot of programming involved. And we're also going to take a look at a framework called React, which is that icon in the bottom right here, but it comes later. So first we'll talk about some more advanced HTML and CSS. So front end, lots of HTML, lots of CSS. If you're focusing on styling, maybe a bit less JavaScript. If you're focusing on programming, maybe a bit less CSS, but still you should know some more CSS and HTML. So with HTML, you want to learn about semantics. Semantics are what different kind of elements give as a meaning to their content. So there's all kinds of text elements. We have headers, we have bold text, we have underlined text. That gives a certain meaning, not just as the user of a website, but also to the browser and also to search engines. So SEO, search engine optimization, know which tags to use to make your website more easy to find in the search engines like Google. Google reads your HTML, and based on what's in there and on how that's structured, so that's again the semantics, how your HTML code is structured and what meaning it gives to the content. Based on that, Google and other search engines make decisions. So you can improve your findability by writing better HTML. Accessibility, making your website more accessible to lots of people. People who have an attention disorder, ADHD for example, or people with color blindness. That's not necessarily HTML though, that's more styling. Autistic people, you know, there's an endless list of things. Blind people even can actually use your website. An endless list of things that you might want to take into consideration when you want to make your website so that as many people as possible can use it. So it's more cool stuff we can do with HTML as well. CSS, so there's some more advanced stuff. Things like things like pseudo classes and pseudo elements allow you to select really specific things of an element. For example, if you hover over an element with your mouse, you can select that. You can style the color of the text selection. So if you drag your mouse over text, it usually creates a blue background. You can actually style that to look different. Or the scroll bar of a website you can style. That can be done with pseudo classes and elements. Things like effects like gradients, shadows. You can use transform to rotate or skew or scale elements in 2D or also 3 dimensions, 3D. So you can make 3D elements that look like 3D on your screen with CSS. Etc. There's loads of effects, and you want to learn about animation, which is something you should do subtly. You shouldn't just put your web page full with animations, but they can really be used to actually improve the usability of your website as well. So let's focus a bit more on CSS to create actual layouts. So once you learn the more advanced things of what you can do with CSS, one of the things you want to learn and focus on a lot is creating layouts. Layout is always something that's quite difficult. But there's a couple of tools available for us that allow us to create more cool layouts. Layout is where you position and how everything is aligned, all of these elements. So learning about basics of positioning, the difference between block and inline elements, things that are horizontally separated or vertically separated. Learning about the position property, where you can literally say, I want this item to move over 50 pixels to the right. Learning about Flexbox, which is a great tool that is built in CSS since about 5 years now, that we can use to align items horizontal and vertical with a lot more control. We can control the spacing between multiple items. We can control that one item is directly on the left and the other on the right side of the page, or centering horizontally and vertically. That's always very annoying to do, but Flexbox makes it easy. You can use CSS Grid to make a layout based on columns and rows, which is very common. You have a sidebar, a navbar on top, that's a row. A sidebar can be a column. You have a central area, that's a big column. So CSS Grid, great for layouts. And also you want to learn about responsive layouts, which is very important. One of the most important things you need to do with CSS actually, so that your website looks equally great on mobile screens, very small and narrow screens, but also on larger desktop or laptop screens or tablets. And there's a couple of tricks that you can do that. You can use specific units like viewport width percentages and viewport height percentages to make something half the size of the viewport, let's say. You can think about media queries, which is a way to detect the screen size. And you can say when the screen size is lower than, let's say, 1000 pixels, I want to do this styling, otherwise we'll do other styling. And you want to learn about the mobile first principles of styling. Most people, and possibly yourself included, will be visiting websites on mobile devices. So you should always take that styling first, and then you should think about, okay, let's also make it look great on desktops. But first think about mobile. Now, once you have learned all of the things you can do with CSS, well, maybe you don't have to learn everything, but you might also want to check out SASS, which is an extension to CSS. It stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets, and it fixes a lot of issues that I have with CSS. So SASS is a preprocessor, which means that it's not like code that gets executed when you load your website. What you do is you write your code with SASS files or SCSS files. And then you start a little program called the preprocessor, and it converts your SASS code into CSS code, which the browser understands. The browser does not understand SASS code. But the great thing is we can use SASS code to use all kinds of other cool tools like nesting, which is going to help you a lot when you are struggling with selecting elements in HTML. It is a pain in the ass to write long, complex selectors in CSS code. Nesting allows you to just nest styling for one element with a child element in each other. Partials is how you can work with multiple files. You don't have to put all of your CSS code in a single huge file, which is kind of what CSS is kind of meant for. You can of course use different files by just adding different files in the HTML, but with partials you can basically link files together, which will be considered one big file when it is processed into the actual CSS later. Really nice to develop with. Things like mix-in. Sometimes you'll create very complex styling that you write a lot, let's say some kind of very fancy shadow behind a box, and you want to use that same effect for many things. You can create a mix-in, and then you can apply that mix-in with the shadow on many items with just a single line of code. So it's kind of a way to reuse the same code with a single line of code. So SASS will really improve your quality of life a lot if you're using a lot of CSS. All right, that's all of the things about styling on the front end. Let's talk about JavaScript more. So we've already talked about DOM manipulation a little bit. You should have basic DOM manipulation skills, but there's a lot of DOM manipulation you're going to do with JavaScript. Learning about complex events, how you get data out of events, which key has been pressed, where is the mouse on the screen? Has the mouse entered an area of an element? Does the mouse click? Have you visited this link? Are you clicking on the link? Those are all kinds of events. You want to learn how to traverse the DOM. The DOM is the document object model, the structure of all of these elements. They have child elements, they have parent elements, they have sibling elements. You want to learn how to go up and down and find your way around the nest, or not the nest, the web or the network of all of these elements. You want to learn how to create new elements or how you delete existing elements, so you change the content on the screen. You want to learn, of course, how to change the content, how you add new HTML code. So you can create new, let's say a pop-up when users press a button. You want to show a little pop-up with some content in that pop-up. You also want to change style. If the user hovers over an item, changing the background, for example. You can do all of that with JavaScript. Now, we've already talked about this slide here. This is advanced JavaScript that you should also do when you're learning backend development with JavaScript, but it's equally important for advanced frontend. In fact, we're going to talk about React in a couple of slides. React is a framework that makes it a lot easier to program and make your website dynamic, but it requires some advanced JavaScript. So you should learn this if you want to use a JavaScript framework like React. So learning about the scope, which is where your variables will be accessible, the this keyword, arrow functions, different ways to work with functions a bit better, array methods to handle data in an array, in a list, callbacks, which is functions calling other functions, and asynchronous JavaScript, which you'll be using quite a lot. Similar to the backend, learning about Node and NPM, running JavaScript on Node, because we'll be using Node on the front end to run quite a large amount of tools that run on Node, and we'll be installing them with NPM, and you'll be running those using NPM scripts. So check out NPM and Node also if you're going to do a lot of advanced front-end stuff. So one of the tools you can install with NPM and run with Node is Parcel, or a module bundler. So what is a module bundler? Some of you may be familiar with Webpack. Webpack is, in my opinion, It's a great module bundler, but it is hard to set up. It's very hard to configure. So not really great for beginners. Parcel works right out of the box. So what is a module bundler? So as you're going to work with some more advanced JavaScript, loads of CSS files, which kind of is fixed by SASS, but let's say you're going to work with a lot of JavaScript files. It becomes a pain in the ass to make sure that all of your HTML pages get the right JavaScript files. Let's say you have 50 JavaScript files, 50 scripts at some point for a very large app, and all of your pages need different files, and you need to spend ages of time configuring your HTML code so that it uses the correct JavaScript files in the correct order, and it's just a pain in the ass. This is why we have module bundlers. These are tools that look at your JavaScript code and figure out what other code you need in another JavaScript file. So what it will do then is it will look at this structure of, let's say one JavaScript file needs a variable from another file. It will look at that, and we run a module bundler, and it will then basically put all of the code from those two files in the same file. So the browser will at the end receive a single huge JavaScript file, which is actually better for the browser. It makes it run faster as well. But we as developers still have the luxury of working in many JavaScript files, which is actually great because we don't want to put everything in one huge unorganized file. We want to organize these files in folders so we can find exactly what data and what file we're looking for. So Parcel is a tool we can install with npm that installs the Parcel CLI, the command line interface. So we get a couple of commands that run Parcel. And it's really simple. It's just a single command you want to learn. And Parcel will take a look at Parcel will look at imports and exports in your files, which is how you link these files that require data from another together. And it creates something known as a bundle, which is just an output folder. That is the folder you want to present to your browser. That is the folder you want to put on your hosting provider. And that will be all of your JavaScript files bundled together in a single huge file, which is great for the browser. But we only have to add a single file in our HTML and then import and export from those files with a little bit of code. It's way easier than to mess around with all of the script tags in HTML. Highly recommend checking out Parcel. If you want some more configurability, maybe check out Webpack, but Webpack is quite difficult. I still struggle with it. I've used it a couple of times, but I usually just stick to Parcel. All right, so at this moment, you are really good at front-end development, but you have only been using just simple, ordinary, what we call vanilla JavaScript. Let's talk about a front-end framework, or a front-end library, really, like React. There's a couple of frameworks / libraries that do similar things. You may have heard about Angular. You may have heard about Vue, V-U-E. You may even have heard about Svelte, which is quite new. But most popular is React for a good reason. I like it a lot. I think it's the best framework to learn as a beginner. You can easily learn other frameworks once you understand how React works. But I recommend starting with React. So what does it do? So what you'll very quickly discover if you're making advanced apps with JavaScript is that you'll do a lot of document object model manipulation. And you will use a lot of JavaScript files, and those files create and modify HTML a lot. It can be organized a bit better. What you can do with React is create things in a single JavaScript file called a component. And a component is one section of your website. It can be an input field where we enter information and we want to send that information somewhere. That could be a single component. And in this file that represents that component, we handle not only the JavaScript that reads what the user has input and then send it to a server, let's say, but it also handles how that component should look. So we can add the HTML in that JavaScript file. And we can also even add styling in the JavaScript file. So instead of having different files for your whole website, one huge HTML file for your whole website, we split up our website into small sections, creating a modular design basically. And each of those little modules or components does its own thing, and it handles itself. So that's really great. So that makes it really, really nice to organize your website and to reuse code. Because if you have, let's say, a social media website and I want to display a post, well, I don't want to use some JavaScript to just generate that post every time. I just want to use a post. So I'm going to create this component, which has all of the behavior and the looks on how a component should behave and should look. And then we can just reuse that post component and feed it in data for what content it should represent. So it allows us to reuse that code a lot. So React can be installed with an npm package called create React app. create React app. It's an npm package you can execute, and that package will run some code and set up a React project ready to go. So things you should learn about React is JSX. This is how you can actually write what looks like normal HTML in JavaScript. It's called JSX. You want to learn what components are, how you create them with functions. You want to learn about properties, which is how you give components data. For example, our post component needs to know the string of text it needs to render as the title or as the text in that post. You want to learn about state and effects. So states are variables that when you update that variable, it also automatically update the component. So maybe that variable holds the name of a person. Well, if you change the name of the person, you also want to change the name of the person as it is displayed on the screen, as it is rendered. When you change your state, it automatically does that. It reacts to changes in these variables. That's why we have the name React. Effects are called side effects. So this is how we control when a component is updated. Conditional rendering is how we decide when to render a component, when not to render a component, how we can do different pages with React. So we render content of one page only when the URL is a specific path, stuff like that. And you might want to check out the context API. So the context API is a way for React to handle data that needs to be accessible in many components at once. So the idea about React is that you have these self-contained components that can communicate to each other by giving each other properties. But sometimes you just have data that your whole application needs, like whether or not the user is logged in. That might be just a value that you want to expose to all of the components. We could use context for that. So once you have learned React, I mean, you're really a master of frontend. I mean, you can do all kinds of things. There's still way more stuff to learn, but this is really awesome for the frontend. Now, there's one other thing I would like you to check out. Maybe you are interested in other platforms, like not just websites, but native apps on mobile phones, or Windows programs, or Mac programs, or Linux. There are, of course, languages that allow you to make those. For example, if you want to make an Android app, you need to learn Java. And if you want to program on Windows, you might want to learn C# or C++, also for Mac and Linux. But it requires you to use different programming languages. Now, what we have now, and this becomes more and more popular, is a couple of different ways we can use the web languages like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to create Windows programs, Mac programs, Linux programs, Android, iOS apps, and websites. So this is great for companies, of course, because previously they would have to hire 5 development teams to make the same app over and over again for making it work on Windows, making it work on Mac, making it work on Linux, also in a browser as a website, and on Android and on iOS. Nowadays, you can just use the same code you use for your website and use it on a mobile app or as a Windows program. So there's a couple of different methods you can go and create that. Relatively new, but gaining a lot of popularity, and I think has a pretty good future, are progressive web apps, PWAs. These are basically browsers, or you can set up your browser with a certain website, that is a PWA, to behave like it is a normal mobile app. So we just have our website, and with only very small amounts of extra code, what we can do is have, when the user visits that website in their browser on their phone, have a little icon show up, install on this device, or install on the home screen. And then suddenly the user has an icon on their home screen, and if they press that, it opens up the app. But it doesn't open up the browser which goes to the website. It looks like a normal app. So basically, it opens up a browser window that only does the rendering and the code execution. It actually doesn't allow you to go to different websites. So now you still render your app with HTML CSS and you run the same code with JavaScript, but it behaves like it's a normal app. And you also have access to the phone, like gyroscope, and you can make calls maybe even. The user has to install that app, so it gives permission to all of those things, of course. So PWAs allow you to use the same code for your browser app to make an actual mobile app. Electron is a tool based on Node.js that allows you to use the same code to also work on Windows, Mac, and Linux. So it basically opens up a browser window that acts like it is a normal computer program on Mac, Linux, and Windows. So kind of the same idea, but then for computers instead of smartphones. React Native is also a way to create apps on different platforms using React. So that might also be something to check out. You have a little bit more control over things with React Native than with PWAs, for example. So those are some things you might want to check out. Right. Well, with that said, we have reached the end of this video. So again, this is the process you should start at if you have never done any web development before. Otherwise, you should just continue where you've left off. Start with those basic skills I've mentioned and then choose on either specifying on the backend and the front end. And then once you have learned a bit about the backend or a bit about the front end and you decide, well, I would also like to check out the back or the front end, the other thing, then you can check that out, of course, and you can become what we call a full stack developer who does a bit of both or does a lot of both. And I personally like full stack development. I like to create the visible websites with user input, user interfaces, and I like the more hardcore programming part of the backend and databases, and it's a bit more dry, so I like to mix it up with a bit of styling as well on the front end. It's just fun, but pick whatever you want. There's jobs on all three sides, doesn't matter. The most important thing though, if you're learning, is to have fun. Don't learn too much, don't get a burnout, just have fun. Also, Google is your friend. Don't think that if you've watched a tutorial you should already know everything. Whenever you struggle with something for more than a couple of minutes, just Google about it, and that is the best way to learn in my opinion. Google everything and make your own projects. Don't keep on watching tutorials forever. Make your own stuff and then look at tutorials or look at Google or articles online if you are stuck. So have fun, make some cool stuff. Love to know what you found about this video in the comments below. If you like this video, like or press the like button and subscribe to the channel, and you'll find a lot of tutorials and other videos like this one. Alright guys, thank you for watching. See you later.